So thank you, Father, for this opportunity to learn about your plan for us. Thank you, Father, for helping us to look into your word. We ask that you'll open our eyes, our ears, and our hearts so that we can hear, see, and understand what you say. And we thank you in the name of Yahushua. Amen. All right. Parsha Yashiev. Three important things happen in this Torah portion. Actually, four important things happen in this Torah portion. One of those things actually starts to happen in the prior Torah portion, which we didn't talk about, where Jacob is blessed. Okay? Jacob is blessed. And then in chapter 35, verses 10 through 12, Elohim actually speaks to him and says, you're no longer going to be called Jacob, you will be called Israel. And this is where it becomes a commandment. Okay? Because in the Torah, when it says, you will no longer be this, you will be this, and it comes from Elohim, it is therefore a commandment. Okay? However, in that commandment, the word that's used for no is still lo. So Jacob has to make the choice to be Israel as opposed to remaining Jacob. What also happens in that particular set of grouping of verses is that Jacob is given the blessing of Abraham. He's given the land, he's given the prosperity, he's given everything that's there. And he's told to stay there. Okay? So Jacob has already acquired a great deal of wealth with Laban. Just as a rabbit trail off the beaten path, we remember that Jacob set his camp in three different stages, with the important things in the middle and then the things that he could, lose on the other two sides. And he meets with Esau. And he offers Esau a gift. Okay? Esau, however, rejects the gift. Even though Jacob insists that he take it, Esau never actually takes it. We don't read about it. It doesn't mention it. Why would Esau reject a gift from Jacob? Because if Esau accepted a gift according to the traditions of the people back then, Esau would be indebted to Jacob. So, if he was indebted to Jacob, then what would happen 400 years and some change later when they want to cross through the land of the Edomites? They would have had to let them through. So, just a little rabbit trail. Just a little rabbit trail. But, so, that's the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens is Joseph comes into the picture. Okay? And Joseph becomes the favorite son. He's the son that was born of Rachel, the first son. Rachel had been barren all these years, and all the other boys and Dinah had been born. And finally she gives birth to Joseph. And Joseph becomes Jacob's favorite. He dotes over Jacob, gives Jacob, when we read it straight from the Torah, gives him a long robe. Well, we've translated it. The rabbis have helped us out by giving us some additional information in the Talmud that it was a robe of many colors, although the Torah doesn't actually specify that it was a robe of many colors. However, we have to take into account the possibility that the rabbis might have been onto something, that it was a robe of many colors. But it was a long robe, and it covered Joseph fully. And that is the point that we have to actually pay attention to. Okay? So what does Joseph mean? Joseph means that Yahuwah has added. Yahuwah has given. Yahuwah has given a blessing. Okay? Yahuwah has made fruitful. Okay? And now has the covering. Okay? The fullness of Israel is contained within Joseph. Okay? And if we take into account the coat of many colors, then we consider that the robe in and of itself represents all the 12 tribes and the fruitfulness and the plenty that they contain within the 12 tribes. Okay? The robe also represents something that is given to a prince. So the prince is contained within Joseph. Okay? Another event that takes place in this Torah portion is that Joseph is kind of a sniveling brat that likes to tattletale on his brothers. And he likes to play daddy's favorite. So daddy sends him out to check and see what his brothers are doing. Then he happens to find them all lounging instead of paying attention to the flocks. The brothers grab him, they throw him into a pit, they take away his coat of many colors, and Reuben is going to go pull him out of the pit, clean him up, send him back to daddy. But before Reuben can do that, Judah, very important, Judah sells him out. Okay? Judah sells him out. This will play a big part a few hundred years in the future. Judah sells him out, sells him to the Midianites and the Ishmaelites, who actually take him into Egypt, and he ends up in slavery. The coat of many colors, the long robe, the outer husk of the prince, is torn and dipped in the blood of a male goat. Okay? Now, if we've read anything about the sacrifices in Leviticus, we know that the blood of a male goat is one of those things that is offered for the redemption towards hatat, towards straying off course. We won't use the word sin because sin is an overrated word that really doesn't mean anything. I have no idea what the word sin actually means. It was given to us by our friends of the Catholic Church to say that you have levels of doing bad things that will cost you, and you have levels of doing good things that will bless you. But the goat was sacrificed and the blood was given as an atonement for straying off course. Okay? We have to consider, I'll just throw this in here as a side note, nowhere in the Torah is it ever asked that there be a human sacrifice requiring the blood of a human being for the atonement of sin, for the forgiveness of sin. Okay? That's a Greco-Roman idea, because the Romans would sacrifice people. And to whatever particular deity of the day they needed to sacrifice people to, for whatever reasons they had to sacrifice that person to. So, the coat of many colors is another aspect that we consider in this. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. The third aspect that we have to consider is something that is just thrown in there. Oh, by the way, okay, Tamar is married to one of Judah's sons who dies. She is barren, or she doesn't have any children. Marries the next son in line so that they can carry out the tradition that the son will, if he die, or if the husband dies, the brother can marry the wife so that she can have children for her husband. So he dies, and Judah promises the youngest son, but never delivers. Judah never delivers. Judah promises to help, but never delivers on the promise. Very important because it plays out in the prophets. Judah had the responsibility of helping the house of Israel, but never played out on the promise. Second thing that we see in Tamar is that Judah conceives with Tamar through deception and never recognizes Tamar. That also is very important because to this day, Judah does not recognize the other tribes. Okay, so and this is actually mentioned at the end side of Matthew, where the Pharisees tell Pilate, "Hey, we need to post guards unless his disciples come and steal the body." And then once he is resurrected, they come up with a story. Well, his disciples came and stole the body. He didn't resurrect. And it tells us in Matthew, this is what is believed to this day. All right? The problem with that is that if Jews today, if Israel today, whatever you want to call them, had been shown, according to the Torah and the prophets, what Yahushua had come to accomplish in putting the tribes back together, it would have been a totally different story. But you cannot try to teach Jews Christian doctrine, because it doesn't make any sense to them, because a human being cannot be sacrificed for the forgiveness of sin. But we have someone who paid 30 shekels to reevaluate, to revalue the 10 tribes, and then shed blood to restore a covenant. That is something that makes total sense to them. And they would understand that all 12 tribes are come together again, thus restoring the prince back to where he has to be, and thus we can have a prince in Ezekiel. Okay? Tamar is also very important, because Tamar is the inauguration of the plan of redemption by and through Mashiach. Through Tamar would come David. From David would come Zerubbabel, and from Zerubbabel ultimately would come Yahushua. Okay? So Tamar plays out a very important role. It goes into the dreams that David has in prison, and we're not going to really touch on those because those actually go with something else. But we're going to focus on those first three things. Okay? So, Jacob is blessed with abundance. This is Parsha Yashiev, Bereshit 37, 1 through 40, 23 is the full Torah portion. Yashiev means, and he dwelt. Okay? So the question that we would come up with, to formulate before we get to the sod portion, is where do we dwell? Okay, what do we dwell on? Is another question that we would ask. But we're going to look at the Pashat, and then we're going to look at the Remez Deresh. Then we'll consider the sod towards the end of it all. So the Pashat, Jacob is blessed with abundance. Chapter 35, 10 through 12, which is right before this Torah portion, that Elohim himself gives him the name Israel and blesses him with the abundance of Abraham. We find that in our Torah portion last time, it simply tells us that a man wrestled with Jacob, and the man told him that he would be. Okay? But this is different now, because this is Elohim telling him the same thing that he was told prior. Okay? You will no longer be called Jacob. Your name is Israel. Okay? I'm going to give you all the stuff that Abraham had. All right? So, Jacob loves Joseph, the son of Rachel, above his other sons, and gives him a long robe, often described as a coat of many colors. Again, the coat of many colors thing is a Talmudic idea. Okay? It's not mentioned anywhere in the Torah. All right? His brothers are very jealous of Joseph and develop a hatred towards him. Why? Because Joseph is very attached to his father and has a tendency to tell his father things that the older brothers do. Okay? He's a brat. He's a brat kid. But from a brat kid, through his slavery, he transitions into a leader. But that's a different story. Joseph goes into the field to see what his brothers are doing at the request of Jacob. It's here that he's assaulted by his brothers, thrown into a pit, and sold into slavery. Okay? Again, Reuben wanted to save him, didn't do that. Judah sells him. Okay? Judas Iscariot would sell out to Yahushua. Judas Iscariot would sell out the redemption that came for Israel and leave Israel in slavery. Okay? By the same note, Jacob would dishonor the promise made to him by Yahuwah Elohim and go to Egypt to reside. Instead of following the commandment, stay here, he would go. And Elohim, we read that he actually said, okay, if that's what you're going to do, that's what you're going to do. Go ahead. He never really actually blesses it, but he says, go ahead. I'll be with you, but you're going to have to remember me. And what happens in 400 years? They forget. And it isn't until we read that they finally started to call upon his name that he heard them and came and brought them out of Egypt. All right, so his robe is shredded, dipped in the blood of a goat, and presented to Jacob as proof that Joseph has been killed by wild animals. Jacob is distraught and cannot be comforted over the loss of his beloved Joseph. Very important. Jacob cannot be comforted. Okay? Judah would never recognize Mashiach. They would never receive the comfort of what happened with Yahusha and the reunification of the kingdom under Yahusha. And to this day, they are still controlled by the Edomites. Esau never accepted the gift, so Esau retained the control. Okay? All right. The second event in this Torah portion is the story of Tamar. I can say story because Francois was not here. The story of Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law. Tamar's husband, Judah's son, dies without passing on an heir. Tamar is given to his brother, who also dies, leaving Tamar childless. She's betrothed to Judah's youngest son, but Judah fails to allow the marriage to take place. Okay? Judah fails in his responsibility to bring forth heirs for his sons. But in that, we also consider that Judah fails in his responsibility to maintain the kingdom intact. Judah had the responsibility to minister to the house of Israel, and they simply did not do that. They tried. It wasn't for lack of trying. We read that there was a second Passover that was offered because people had come to Moses and said, we've touched a dead body, we can't do the Passover. And Moses talked to Elohim, and Elohim said, okay, well, in the second month, have a second Passover. So down the road, and the king just went totally out of my head. I want to say it's either Josiah or Jehoshaphat, I cannot ever remember. But one of the kings decides, because they have been without the Torah, because they have not been able to fully embrace it, and they've just gotten it, and they're beginning to embrace it, that they cannot celebrate the Passover. They're going to celebrate a second Passover. And they offer to the house of Israel to come and partake of the second Passover. Some people sneak out and go down, but the house of Israel as a whole will not do that. And the issue is not pressed. Okay? The only thing that Judah actually ever had to do with the house of Israel is that they became business partners and opened up trade routes between both of them so that they could both grow wealthy in the process. But they never brought Elohim into any of it. All right? So Tamar deceives Judah by disguising herself as a prostitute and becomes pregnant by Judah, and thus brings forth the line of David from which Yahusha would come. It's a whole lot of stuff in that little story of Tamar. That's the Extreme Reader's Digest version. Okay? So we have Jacob, a representation of Judah having supplanted something. What they supplanted was their love of Torah. Today they've supplanted it with their adherence to Talmud and the principles found in Talmud. Torah is simply a byproduct. And Judah, in and of itself, thought just went out of my head, but what we have in Jacob is Judah, something that has been supplanted. Okay? We have in Joseph the house of or the kingdom of Israel, the prince, clothed, representation of all 12 tribes, and the fruitfulness and what Elohim has given contained within those tribes. But we also find that since Judah is the one that actually sells them into slavery, that Judah betrays Israel by not doing its part in ministering to the house of Israel. The result is that the coat is torn to pieces. The kingdoms separate. We're getting way ahead of ourselves, so we'll go back to the notes. Okay. All right. We turn the page. I was pretty excited when I was reading all this and saying, okay, well, this is cool. All right. So, Ramez and Deresh, the story of Joseph and the coat offers us a glimpse of how the fruitfulness of what Yahuwah Elohim has given to Jacob, Israel, is discarded when supplanted by a desire outside of the promise and the blessing of Elohim. Okay, what happened? Jacob is given a promise. I'm giving you all of this. I'll take care of you. But there's a famine in the land. The famine supplants the promise. Okay? What does he focus on? He focuses on the famine instead of focusing on the promise of Elohim. The result is that they go to Egypt. Okay? Joseph is sold where? Into Egypt. So in the little event of Joseph and the coat of many colors, what we have is a foreshadowing of Israel, the children of Israel, ending up in Egypt. Okay? And we also have a foreshadowing after they leave Egypt and establish king and a kingdom, of the kingdom falling apart because the coat of many colors is shred. But we also have a foreshadowing in that of redemption. It takes the blood of a goat to change Hatat. Yahusha would offer the blood to bring them back together in a covenant. Okay, so he would bring them out of having strayed off course back into a covenant relationship. But it would be Judah's responsibility to grasp this. They didn't grasp it. The house of Israel grasped it. But Judah would not allow the house of Israel to come back because they didn't understand what had just happened. That's why Paul, in his teachings to the Galatians, is saying, those who have the Torah, well, Mashiach doesn't profit them. It's those that don't have it to where Mashiach profits them. The house of Judah had the Torah. They had the covenant. They didn't need Yahusha. The house of Israel had the Torah, but they didn't have the covenant. They had to have Yahusha in order to pay the 30 shekels of silver to give them value again. Okay, it's a dowry. And they had to have the blood in order to restore the covenant. The blood didn't take away their sins. The blood restored the covenant. The dowry, the bride has to have value. Otherwise, the husband cannot approach her or approach the father in order to pay a dowry because she's of no value. The bride has to have value in order for the groom to come and take her. Does that make any sense? Israel, in order for Mashiach to be of any value as the groom, would have to have value. So that's with the 30 shekels of silver that Judah actually paid without understanding what was going on. They brought forth Tamar without any grasp of what was going on. All right. So the coat of colors represents the blessing of Elohim and his provision. Joseph. This would be removed as the children of Israel turned to Egypt by their perception of blessing, not Elohim, and over time became slaves to Egypt. Their perception of blessing. We're going to starve here in Canaan, even though Elohim has told us we'll never starve. Our perception is that we can go to Egypt. Our son has a spot for us. We're going to go there. We're going to get the best land that they have. Pharaoh's going to take care of us. And over a period of time, they became a frog in a pot of water where the heat's turned up. And before they knew it, they were boiling. They were in slavery. Okay? That the coat was torn illustrates to us that in time, the very fabric of the kingdom of Israel would be torn into pieces, consisting of the southern kingdom of the house of Judah and the northern kingdom of the house of Israel. Okay, so the coat of many colors, the long robe, represents to us in the futuristic event that the kingdom would split. Only through the blood of a goat could restoration take place. Only through the blood of a goat can chatat be atoned for. And only through the blood of Yahusha would the covenant be restored to bring that coat back together so that it could once again be put over the prince. So without our understanding of this, without Yahusha, we have no prince in Ezekiel. And if we have no prince in Ezekiel, we have no world to come, because the people of the land will never be ministered to by the Kohen Hagadol in the order of Melchizedek. He's here, but we have to be able to recognize him first. And to this point, Judah still has not taken its responsibility in opening the eyes of anyone, because it's still Judah's responsibility to open the eyes of the Gentiles. When I say Gentiles, I'm not talking about something that's not Jewish. Being Jewish is irrelevant. What I'm talking about Gentiles is that within the Gentiles are the tribes of the house of Israel. Okay? They have to understand that they can come back and the prince can be unified. That's slowly beginning to take place, but it has a long way to go, because even though you have this Hebraic roots movement and Messianic Judaism, these are still Baptist intellits. We still are so ingrained in either Talmud. People step away from Christianity and go into what's called Messianic Judaism, and they fall in love with all things Talmud, throw a mess of Hebrew words into their Christian doctrines, and they're still Baptist intellits. And Christianity, on the other hand, is entrenched in the Greco-Roman mindset that they don't understand the thought process of the ancient peoples. So slowly, people are understanding what the ancient Israelites understood, how they thought. It's not about Hebraic roots, it's about Hebraic thought, ancient Hebraic culture. Well, how do the events in the Torah, in the prophets, and in the writings relate to what's going on from the ancient Israelite point of view? And that's where when we go back and we understand it from that point of view, that's when we begin to grasp what's actually going on. Okay? So the price of redemption for chatat is the blood of a goat. Both houses would have to be redeemed for the covenant to be restored. Okay? Judah would still have to, although they didn't lose out in the covenant between them and the house of Israel had to be restored. Okay? The redemption would come through Tamar. This is why we have a story and an event that takes place where it's just outrageous, but it has so much meaning if we understand what's going on, that without Tamar and without Judah and Tamar, there would be no prince. Why did the sons not have children with Tamar? Because it had to be a direct descendant from the direct bloodline from Jacob to Judah, directly to Tamar, to the ongoing line. Okay, it couldn't come through basically what would account to a third party. Okay, we don't know what bloodline Judah's wives came from, so we don't know anything about it. We don't know anything about the sons other than their names. But Tamar, we know a little something about because it tells us where Tamar came from. It wasn't really the greatest thing in the world, but Judah is the bloodline that would be passed on. And through Judah would come David, Zerubbabel, Yahusha, and ultimately the prince would be restored. All right. Judah, however, would not, and to this day has still not recognized that through Judah and Tamar, the means to restore the kingdom has come. Although the way to restore the coat to the state of wholeness came through Yahusha, it remains in shreds because Jacob, as the Torah states, refused to be comforted. Okay? We aren't making any progress because the understanding of what the Torah, the prophets, and the writings and how they relate to Brit Hadashah have not been fully grasped and passed on. Okay? You have an Old Testament that stops here and a New Testament that starts here, thanks to our friend Marcion. Okay? We don't have an Old Testament and a New Testament. We have a single testament that begins in Bereshit chapter 1, verse 1, and runs all the way through the end of Revelation chapter 22. Okay? Emet is what? Truth. Aleph, Mem, Tav. The Aleph is the first letter. The Mem is one of the middle letters. The Tav is the last letter. If you're going to have truth in anything, it has to match the beginning, the middle has to support the beginning, and the end has to be supported by the middle and the beginning. You can't cut it in half and say, that was then and this is now. It doesn't work that way. Not in the Torah. You can't have it in one language and all of a sudden expect to translate it in a second language or a third language. That doesn't work that way. We have a language of Elohim, which is Hebrew. It's not Aramaic. It's not Greek. It's Hebrew. Now, Aramaic is a sister language. It's kind of like Yiddish is today. Yiddish is kind of a Germanized Hebrew. Aramaic is a Persianized Hebrew. When they were in captivity in Babylon, they developed something called Yiddish. And we went from the Paleo or Proto-Hebrew alphabet to the modern block print alphabet. Okay? The meanings are still the same, but we get more meaning when we look at the Paleo Hebrew alphabet than we do when we look at the block print alphabet. Okay? And when we go into Greek, well, we lose it because we're simply trying to translate a word into a language the best we can. And sometimes Hebrew ideas don't translate into Greek. So when we have a Greek New Testament, we lose the ideas and the thought processes that took place through the Torah, the kings, the writings, and the prophets. Okay? Again, it was Constantine that asked a guy named Erasmus to copy the scriptures into Greek, specifically what they were calling the New Testament, to copy it into Greek so it could be distributed amongst the churches. And over a period of 1600 years, Greek was considered to be the lingua franca of Judea. Although it never was and could never have been, Jews spoke Aramaic. They spoke Hebrew. Greek was totally foreign to them after the Maccabees, because when the Maccabees won their thing, they booted out all things Greek. Okay? And people will argue this into the ground to this day. Scholars insist that Greek was the language of Yahusha, but you can't have one language of Elohim and then change it midway in there. Yahuwah says, I am Yahuwah, I do not change. That means I don't change my language. I don't all of a sudden begin speaking Greek. Okay? All right, so what do we have then in this Deresh? Within this storyline of Jacob prospering, giving Joseph the robe, Joseph being sold into slavery, the robe being torn and drenched in the blood of a goat and given back to Jacob, who could not be consoled. We have a foreshadowing of Israel, the children of Israel, the whole kingdom, supplanting what Elohim had given them and taking what Pharaoh was willing to give them and going to Egypt. We have the children of Israel becoming slaves in Egypt. We have the children of Israel leaving Egypt, an old generation dying off, and a new generation coming forth. We have them going into Canaan, and then still wearing the coat, still being the prince, because they were told, if you will listen to my voice and you will guard my covenant, you will be my special people. But going into Canaan and slowly having the coat removed, and then with Rehoboam and Jeroboam having the coat torn into pieces. And it wouldn't be until Yahusha where the coat could be put back together and put back on the entire kingdom so that the prince would be able to come forward. We're all looking for, we all get involved in the end times. Here is a hint of when the end will be near. When all 12 tribes have come together and recognized themselves, then you can start looking for the end to come. Okay? That Biden's going to be president, can I say that on film? Is not the end of the world. Okay? That things are going to get very, very bad, possibly, not because of Biden, but things are going to progressively get worse, does not mean that the end is going to come. Only when the prince is reunited in his fullness will the age of the Adam end and the day of Yahuwah begin. Okay? That's the only way that transition can take place. The robe has to be put back on Joseph. Okay? The only way to do that, we find within the story of Tamar, that a way was made through unconventional means. Doesn't get any more unconventional than Yahuwah having a son and saying, son, you have to die in order to make things happen. And that son had to come from the line of Tamar. Okay? So that is the Deresh Pashat point of view. How about the Sod? Because there is a lesson in every Torah portion that we have to come to grips with. Okay? The Sod in this, we can ask, are we aware of Elohim's blessing and presence in our lives? We've talked about this over the years. It's not simply a matter of saying that I believe in something called God, or I believe in Yahuwah Elohim. Am I aware that he's present? Am I aware that he's in my life? Am I aware that what I have comes from my Elohim? Well, I work for it. Yes. And Elohim blessed you with the skills, the ability to gain those skills, the ability to gain the position that you have to use those skills so that you can earn income and take care of it. You earn income, you have to be a disciple, you have to be a steward of the income that you're given. You're still within Yahuwah Elohim, okay? Everything that I have is a gift. Regardless of how hard in my mind I perceive that I work for it, it is a gift, right? But what happens when we begin to supplant something else in place of that gift? Jacob was given what? Everything. But Joseph became the most important thing in his life, to the point where everything didn't matter. Joseph mattered. And what happened when Joseph died? He ignored everything, and he dwelt on what he'd lost. I have one daughter that tends to be extremely negative. because she's having a hard time. And she had a very difficult time not too long ago. And I said, okay, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. I understand that. What is one positive thing in all of this hardship that you can think of? So she thought, and she came up with one positive thing. I said, okay, we'll dwell on that. How can you make that one positive thing overshadow everything? And what the Sod teaches us is that we have to look at the big picture. I'm enormously blessed with what my Elohim has given me. We are enormously blessed with what our Elohim has given us. We've done nothing on our own. Doors have been opened for us to walk through. We have the belief, but we have to take action on that belief. Faith without works is dead, right? So the Sod portion, what it teaches us is that, do we lose sight of what we have when we perceive to be, when we perceive that what we've, to what, Charlotte, help me. Do we lose sight of it when what we perceive to be what we value most is lost? Do we lose sight of all the wonderful things that we've been blessed with when what we perceive to be the most important thing is gone? You know, people tell me, well, I'll use this as an example. It may be, you know, kind of a not that great of an example, but Trina is always telling me, I hope that she dies first. So why? This is because I won't be able to function without you. I said, okay, well, I'm just one little bitty piece of your life. You have children, you have life, you have a really nice insurance policy. She'd croak me off and be set for life. But anyway, you have all this blessing still. You can't dwell on one thing and not allow yourself to be comforted because you lost the one thing. You know, be happy for me that I'm gone. I'm probably having a nice cup of coffee at some coffee shop somewhere out there in, you know, some galaxy 4 billion light years away, because I can do that when I'm dead. I'm not, you know, I have the access to the full realm of Elohim at that point. So, the Sod portion, very simply, are we aware of Elohim's blessings and presence in our lives? Do we lose sight of this when what we perceive to be what we value the most is lost? And that's the Sod portion. That's the lesson that we get within all of this. Kind of a short, sweet, to the point lesson. But do you see how we have to have an understanding of the Torah? We have to understand the sacrifices in the Torah, or we'll never get why they dipped it in it says a 1-year-old goat, a 1-year-old male goat. They killed it. Why does it tell us it was a 1-year-old male goat? Who cares? But we have to understand that a 1-year-old male goat is required in Leviticus for a certain thing in the sacrificial system. Okay? And it would have to be a Levitical sacrifice. Yahusha was a Levitical sacrifice. Not only was he a Levitical sacrifice, he was the last Levitical high priest to die, ending the Levitical system.
And this was all before the Levitical system.
Yeah. So things are put in place, but if we don't understand the Torah, the prophets and the writings, we cannot ever grasp Brit Hadashah. And we'll certainly never grasp what Paul's talking about. You know, we have the Pauline epistles written to each individual assembly. Those are guidance and advice to pastors and ministers in those particular situations. In those particular situations. If somebody, and he uses a woman, because in Corinth there was one woman who was out of control. And he says, don't allow that woman to speak. Okay? But we don't have to have a woman. He could have used a man, one man, being out of control. What would have happened if Paul would have said, don't allow that man to speak?
That would have never happened.
Then would we have had doctrines today that said men cannot speak in church?
No, that wouldn't happen.
Well, I'm asking, we have to understand that applies to everyone. If someone is giving you problems, then don't pay attention to what they're saying. We can take that into but the Pauline epistles, the letters to the Romans and to the Hebrews, and to the Galatians for that matter, if we don't grasp the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, we will never grasp what he's talking about. We'll never grasp what Yahushua's talking about. If we don't understand the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, we'll never grasp what Revelation is saying if we don't grasp the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Specifically, with Revelation, the book of Genesis. Because the book of Genesis, the Alpha, the Aleph, relates to the book of Revelation, Hazon, that is the Tav. And the Aleph and the Tav together bring us, the two components of truth, but you have to have the Torah, the prophets, and the writings in the middle to have the fullness of Emet. Or the prophets and the writings to have the fullness of Emet. Okay. So all that being said, are there any questions? Yes, I knew it. I was just...
This was excellent. Oh my goodness.
Okay.
That is so good. The whole thing about the 1-year-old male ram.
And I didn't
Goodness.
even go to the Chinese restaurant to get a fortune cookie.
Oh, you've never taught this before.
No.
Okay. Because I'm like, whoa. Back to Esau not accepting the gift. It was last week when, I think it was last week's portion about, it could have been the week before, about Esau, the prophecy about Esau casting off the yoke that was given him, that he would always serve his brother. Okay, by him not accepting the gift, was that him casting off the yoke?
That's a good question. Esau would always, regardless of what Esau perceived, he would always be in subjection to Jacob.
Yeah.
However, that has not happened yet because
Okay, so his yoke, it hasn't
because he didn't accept the physical gift. The birthright belongs to Jacob, regardless. But Esau is still in control. Jacob feared Esau to the point where he had a dream and fought a guy that represented Esau. Okay? To this day, Edom has inbred with Israel to the point that, and I may get in trouble for saying this, but, they've rejected the Torah in their genealogies. Because if your mother's not Jewish, you can't be Jewish. The Torah is very specific that the line comes through the father, not through the mother. Even in Yahushua's case, it was through the father who Joseph, the guardian, the father of Miriam, it's not mentioned that he had a son, he had a daughter. So Yahushua would be Jewish or would fall into the line because of Joseph, not because of Mary. Okay? And this is why he could be high priest and king. But Edom interbred with Israel after the rebellion of Bar Kokhba. In 70, Titus destroyed the temple, destroyed Jerusalem, put them in a form of bondage, but it was loosened up a little bit to where they rebelled again 35 or 65 years later with Bar Kokhba. And when that happened, Israelite men were crucified by the tens of thousands. So there were no men, not enough men left to carry on. And the Israelite women, the Hebrew women being raped, you never knew who the father was that was bringing forth the children. So the rabbis made the change to, if the mother's Jewish, then the child is Jewish, because we don't know who the father was. My father, we can trace his lineage back to Aaron. But because my mother was Catholic, I'm a Catholic. Although my grandmother on my father's side never went with that. I was just as much part of the fold as everyone else, and I studied more with her than I did with anything else, or, you know, what I was taught. So, but anyway, so yes, Edom is still in charge because Edom didn't reject. Edom didn't take the gift, but Edom's not in charge. It's just a perception.
It is a perception.
All right. Anybody else? Really? Okay, well, fine. Be that way. Grooviness has been achieved.